We're back on November 15th, 1994. We are queuing up right now at the boat deck. We're about to take our first steps actually on the Antarctic continent. We've been in the Shetland Islands heading to the Antarctic. We are actually going to take our first steps on the continent. Scheduled today is a Zodiac trip to take a look, a sightseeing tour, and then we're going to visit Wally Herbert's hut. We're in Charlotte Bay, and you can hear the queuing up right now. Great anticipation, big day. We will join you at our next event. You're listening to Visions, a series of visits to almost everywhere, and we are about to set foot, myself anyway, for the first time on Antarctica. And before we do so, we are going to get a little history lesson from one of the great Arctic historians, I guess, Wally Herbert. Good morning or good afternoon, depending when you folks are listening to this, or perhaps good evening, Mr. Herbert. A little bit of your background, then we'll move ahead.
Well, I was born in York in England, and after a few days I was taken to London, and a few weeks longer I was in Egypt, and I lived there until I was 5, and then at the age of 5 I was moved down to South Africa. This was during the war. Didn't come back to England until I was 13, and in that time I didn't go to school either. I didn't have a proper schooling. I just was taught privately on a ranch in the Drakensberg Mountains by an old retired school teacher, and so she was very good at geography and English and history. She didn't know anything at all about maths or science, so I was no good at any of these things. So I came back to England at the age of 13 with absolutely no comprehension of these other subjects. So I then worked very hard for a few years to get my qualifications to go to university, and succeeded, but by that time I was so exhausted I decided I didn't want to go to the university. After all, I went into the army. So I signed up in the army for 22 years in the army, and the army was so pleased to have someone sign up for that length of time that they gave me all kinds of education. You see, I went to school for a year and a half, and they taught me how to make maps, and they taught me how to navigate. Then I went out to Egypt and worked in the Sahara for a little while making maps. So by the time I was 20, I was a map maker, qualified map maker. And then I managed to get out of the army, to my surprise as much as everybody else's, and to the total disgust of the army themselves, because they spent so much money on educating me. And then I hitchhiked back to England from Egypt. And then when I was driving to work one day in England in a bus, and it was absolutely pelting down with rain, and everyone was soaking wet, and horrible smell of steamy wetness, you know. And off the top of the rack where you put your luggage, there was a newspaper. It fell into my lap. There was a Daily Telegraph, and I remember it was already open at the page where they have advertisements for jobs. And my eye fell on a little job called, a little tiny notice saying, Expedition to Antarctica. And it was saying that they needed surveyors for 3 years. So I thought this was brilliant, and so I went into the John, the loo, the lavatory, whatever you like to call it.
Water closet?
The WC. Put the seat down, sat on the seat, wrote my application form. This is how I was supposed to be working, you see, so I had to have an excuse. I sent this off, and I got the job. Well, at least I went through an interview and all that, and eventually I was given the job. And my theory is that they gave me the job over all of the others because I'd had this experience. I'd done some unusual things already by the age of 20. And so they thought, well, if you're that unusual, well, then you're a safe bet for the Antarctic.
And what year was this?
This was 1955, and I was there for nearly 3 years.
And what did you do in the 3 years? You were a sort of a forerunner. I mean, you're part of the history of the region. Talk about the 3 or 4 years, 3 years.
Well, I mean, when I came down in 55, I mean, there was probably about 80% of the Antarctic was still unexplored, totally, utterly blank on the map, nothing. And one of the reasons why I was so pleased to come down here at that time was that things were changing very fast. I mean, airplanes were coming in, but they hadn't actually reached us. The Americans were using airplanes on their part of the Antarctic. They were doing a lot of work with airplanes. But in our part of the Antarctic, there were none. There were no air photographs, no airplanes, very few radios that worked. So I was lucky in that sense because I was living in the past, you know. So our methods of moving around and driving dogs and making maps was very, very old-fashioned, traditional, very much like they did in Scott's and Shackleton's day. And so I had that experience of sort of being 1 foot in the past. And also I was very, in a way, lucky because by the time I came down in '55, all of the easy bits had been done. The only bits that were left undone were the difficult bits, and they're always the most interesting. So I was left with the most difficult bit to do, which was the plateau of the peninsula of the Antarctic, which was very difficult to get up and even more difficult to get off.
Some of the highlights of that period, now that we've spoken about what you were doing, what are some of the highlights, the discoveries for you at that point?
Well, the thing is, in those days, because we had no aeroplanes to supply depots of food, because we had no radios to communicate properly with each other, that when we wanted to make a long journey, a one-way journey in particular, then you had to spend like 2 years laying depots of supplies. So you go off with your sledges and your dogs with very heavy loads, as much as you could carry, maybe 1,500 pounds, and with 9 dogs pulling. And you'd maybe have 2 teams of dogs and 4 men. Now you'd go for maybe 300 miles, and you'd leave all the food that you could, and then come back home on half rations. Then next time you went out, you go out again with heavy loads, and you go beyond that point and lay another one. So you keep on over a period of 2 years or so, laying these caches of food. Now these days, of course, you just fly an airplane out and it lands and gives you the food and they take pictures and off you go. In the old days, well, you couldn't do that, and so you were much, much more isolated in those days.
So in other words, you're saying you were kind of laying a trail for later on,
That's it.
where there was food along the way as you moved along. So you were that's
Yeah.
pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Let's talk
But
about.
you see, there was no one there to come and eat it. I mean, unlike in the Arctic, you couldn't do that in the Arctic. The polar bears would come and eat it, or the foxes or something.
Right.
In the Antarctic, there's no land animal that will take your food. So as long as the wind didn't blow it away, you know, it was going to be there 2, 3, 5, 10 years time.
Right. Were you burying, or just how are you storing it?
Oh, yeah. Well, we usually took the precautions of putting rocks around it, and maybe even tying it all up and putting guy ropes and so on,
Right.
just to make sure it wouldn't blow away.
But then you have penguins there, and you have I don't know at that you know where you were. If you, I guess you had penguins. You had some sort of animal life, but they didn't bother it.
No, generally speaking, the penguins are just around the coast, and where we were laying our supplies, there was out of sight of penguins anyway. Penguins also only live there for a short time each year. And this is one of the things that most people don't seem to realize, you know. They go down, they want to go and see the penguin rookeries, and this is symbolic of the Antarctic. It's very, you know, the penguin is the symbol of the Antarctic. And yet, in fact, they only spend a few months there. I mean, man spends much more time.
Where are they when they are not in the Antarctic?
Well, they go off north in the winter time.
And they're swimming, of course.
Swimming, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, give us an overview of the Antarctic. You're a map maker. Paint us a map.
Well, the map in the old days, I mean, way back when I was there, was a map of unexplored country. So, you know, the methods that you used to make maps were really, really simple, old-fashioned ways of doing it. The old explorers' ways. But of course, then there came the airplanes, and then came the air photographs, then came the satellites, and in no time at all the maps are completed.
But what sort of paint us a map now on audio? What does it look like? What is?
Well, I mean, it's a hell of a big continent. I mean, it's most of it is ice cap anyway. The only really interesting bits from a map maker's point of view are the mountain ranges, or the bits that stick out of the ice cap.
Right.
And some of these go to quite a fair size height, like up to about 17,000 feet, that sort of thing. I've been up to about 13,500 on several occasions, making maps from the summits.
Right.
But yes, I mean, most of the mountain areas are around the Antarctic, around the perimeter of the Antarctic, and then there's one trans-Antarctic range which goes most of the way across the Antarctic, and that's a spectacular looking mountain range. And that was actually the territory that I was mapping when I was with the New Zealanders. And I was lucky enough to be really the last man to make a map on the ground, on foot, because the year after I finished that map, then airplanes flew over and took photographs, and so it was no longer possible to make a map of completely unexplored country. There was always some photographs available of that territory, And that, of course, took all the steam out of it as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
I mean, one of the most magical things about making maps of unexplored country is you might take, say, 3 days or 3 weeks to go along a coastline to a cape you could see way in the distance, and you didn't have the faintest idea what lay beyond that cape. Now, when you get to that cape and you round the cape, then all the land you see stretching out before you has never been seen by the human eye before. You're the first human being to see that.
Right.
And the same, of course, happens when you climb a mountain and you look over the ranges which lie beyond. You're the first human being to ever see that.
Right.
And that was absolutely magical. Now, as soon as there were air photographs available, it didn't matter that man had never been there before. I knew what was going to be there, so I wasn't interested. So I then moved up to the Arctic.
What about temperature swings, and what are we likely to encounter? What will we encounter temperature-wise when we get there?
Well, this time of year, you know, it's really quite mild, relatively speaking. And, you know, with the right clothing, the right food and so on, it's quite balmy. I mean, it's just below freezing point or just a few degrees above freezing point. But you're not going to get any wrinkles, you're not going to get any frostbites, you're not going to get any ice in your beard.
Okay.
But you're going to feel cold from time to time just by simply being outside and exposed to the wind for a while. Now, in the wintertime in the Antarctic, that's a different story. You know, it's one of the coldest places on the face of the Earth. On the other hand, if you're living there in the winter, you don't, if you're clever, go outside in the winter. You have all your instruments outside, and they're all sort of have magic wires which come into the hut, and you just push a button and it tells you what the temperature is. You don't actually have to go out there. Except that when I was there in 1962 with the New Zealand expedition, I was responsible for all the dogs, looking after the dogs. The dogs, of course, they stay outside the whole winter. So even in temperatures down to about -50, they would still be outside. And
Now,
I
this
would have
is
to
the
go
temperature,
outside
not...
every day.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'd have to go outside every day to look after the dogs, you know, to make sure they're okay and feed them and so on.
The first footsteps at Antarctica, what year would that be? What era?
I mean, the dates that Amundsen got there was in 1911, and right at the end of 1911. I can't remember the exact date, in December. And then Scott was there just a few weeks later in January, I think, of 1912.
What about your position in history in the Antarctic? I mean, you were there early on, not quite that early on. Where do you stand? Now, you've written 9 books, I believe.
Yeah.
I don't know if, I guess not only on the Antarctic, but where do you stand? Where do you place yourself in the history of the region?
It's an interesting one, that, because in many ways I'm part of it. So one foot on both sides. I mean, sort of on the cusp, you know, where... Because if you look back, say, over the period from Fridtjof Nansen, the great Norwegian explorer of the Arctic, and right through to, say, Admiral Byrd, all of the great sort of explorers that came together, so to speak, to finally reach the North and the South Poles were all in that period of about 60 years. Now, right at the tail end of that, Admiral Byrd, now I was actually in the Antarctic when Byrd was making his last expedition. I was making my first expedition. On the other hand, what then happened was that shortly after that, the Antarctic was crossed from one side to the other, and that in a way left only one big journey to make in the world at that time, and that was the journey across the North Pole, because Everest had been climbed, the Antarctic continent had been crossed, and now there was only one thing left, and that was the crossing of the North Pole. And that was what I ended up by doing. So in a way, I'm sort of tied into that period of pioneers, but right at the tail end of it. Because everyone that came after me, I would describe as an adventurer as opposed to an explorer, because they didn't actually explore anything. Yeah. I was the last one that actually produced a map of unexplored country. Although the word explorer, of course, is used so sort of freely these days.
And that map was in 1963, am I right on that date?
Well, 1962 was really the date that I finished my last actual mapping in the field. But then it took me a year to put the map together in New Zealand before the thing was finished. So I guess the publication date was 63.
Right. Okay, briefly, I know I think we're getting ready to something is going to be happening in a few moments. What is the thrill for you? I mean, is it kind of old hat to be visiting here again?
Well, you know, in a way it is. I mean, I am one of these people that hates going to the same place twice. So this is probably why I'm a pioneer in that sense, and making maps and so on. But that also applies to everything else I do in life. So, I mean, I'm coming back this time because I would really love to go back to Hope Bay, which was my old base in the Antarctic. And I haven't been there for about 38 years. And the last couple of times that I've been down, we got close to it, but there was too much ice. So I'm really hoping to go back. Now, if we succeed, then I would say there's a very slim chance indeed that I'll ever be coming back. Because I've seen it, I want to go and do something else.
Lord Shackleton, son of famed polar explorer Ernest Shackleton, called Wally Herbert a phenomenon, a man who has traveled further and more uncomfortably in the polar regions than any explorer alive today. And His Royal Highness, Prince Philip of Great Britain, called his 1968-69 16-month, 3,800-mile trek with 3 companions and 40 dogs the first surface crossing of the Arctic Ocean pack ice, which historians call the last great journey on Earth, and the first on foot from Alaska to Spitsbergen via the pole of inaccessibility, a great triumph of human skill and endurance. We're with Wally Herbert now. Wally, talk about the first day of that incredible journey.
In a way, I suppose in a sense that the most difficult part of the journey was the first few miles of the journey, because we were not experienced at traveling on moving ice. It was dark, it was scary. I even remember the very first day of the journey being very, very sick, and the whole of the night before I was sick. And I imagine it's very similar to in World War I, when they were waiting in the trenches, to have the whistle was going to blow, and they were all going to run up over the parapets and go charging across no man's land. It was that kind of a thing, because we had absolutely no way of knowing whether we were going to survive this journey. I mean, no one had ever attempted it before. We didn't know whether the dog food was adequate. There was no way we could turn around and come back. I mean, the first step of that journey was the first step of a journey of nearly 3,800 miles, and we had to go right the way across or die in the process, because there were no airplanes that could get to us to pull us out. And so, setting off on a journey like that, you're right at the leading edge, the sharp edge of exploration. You're the pioneer. I mean, no one's ever done it before. And so you have no idea at all whether you're going to survive. And that is very scary.
Your work in the Arctic as opposed to your work in the Antarctic, what gives you the most satisfaction? Which of these have left the most questions in your mind?
I think, in a way, the Arctic is a physically much more dangerous environment to be in, because the sea ice is moving all the time. It's dark. You travel in the dark for a lot of the year. You travel on much more dangerous glaciers. The ice basically just behaves in a much more unpredictable way in the Arctic. And for me, all of my toughest journeys have been in the Arctic. So I have lots of painful and colourful memories of my times in the Arctic.
His Royal Highness Prince Charles, the current Prince of Wales, feels that one day Great Britain should mark your achievements by having you stuffed and put on display. How do you feel about being stuffed and put on display? And are they going to wait for the appropriate time?
I'm not too keen on the idea of being stuffed and put on display, but in actual fact, I mean, they came as close to it as I hope they'll ever come to it, when they got a tailor's dummy, and they put this up in the Scott Polo Research Institute in Cambridge, and they have a museum there, and behind this glass case is now a sort of a dummy which is dressed in my Arctic clothing. Now, the pity, of course, is that most of these dummies you see in shop windows are 6 foot tall, because they're all sort of macho hero type men, and they don't cater for people like me who are only 5'8". And so this dummy has clothes on which don't fit it. There are gaps in the clothing, and of course it looks ridiculous.
They may want to stuff you a little early after you turn about the portal point, taking down the ceremonial taking down of the signs on your hut. If and when that gets back to Great Britain, how do you think they'll feel about stuffing you at that point?
They'd probably be delighted to, yes, but I think they'll find it very difficult to do, because they'd have to do it in an obvious sort of way. And by obvious, I mean through the newspapers. And so I think we'll have a wonderful battle on our hands.
Listening to your lecture just now, I remember watching with my family. My daughter was a year old at that point, watching Neil Armstrong land on the moon. And at that precise time, you were winding up in the North Pole for one of your great successes, but you were overwhelmed, I guess, the news because of Neil Armstrong being an international story. And when you arrived for the victory, celebration, two women in a pushchair where they had. What were your feelings then?
Yeah, well, the amazing thing about it was as we were coming into Portsmouth in England, all of the ships had got word of the fact that we were coming back from the Arctic, having succeeded in crossing the Arctic. And all of the ships were blowing their hooters and horns and all that stuff, you know. It was a wonderful experience. Even the Royal Yacht Britannia pulled out to let us use its berth as a sign of respect. But of course there were only just these two people in the pushchair because the press hadn't been informed.
Were they happy to see you? The two ladies with pushchair?
I don't think they batted an eyelid. I don't think they knew what it was all about.
Before closing, we spoke of your wonderful paintings that you've done, and we're looking at them now. You had mentioned something about having these dreams of these paintings and then painting them. Speak about that, and also your painting of Prince Charles.
Well, what happened was that the very first painting was such a surprise to me. This was about 4 years ago. And I just really had burnt out with writing books. I've written 9 books. And my wife, who's a psychotherapist, said, okay, have a go at painting. I mean, try to work some of your frustration off with painting. And so I had to go, and I did one painting, and it was amazing. I mean, it sold straight away. And so I decided then to have a meditate about this and think about it. So I went into a state of meditation, and in this sort of state I had a vision in which I was sitting in a preview theatre in Soho in London. And it was a 36-seater, and I was watching on the screen some colour slides going through in sequence, and they were all of paintings, and some of these were very fine and pieces of work, and some were historic pictures, paintings of historic pictures. And I thought, well, you know, that student of art is quite clever. And then, to my surprise, I saw 1 or 2 pictures which could only have been seen by me, because I'm the only person in the world that's ever been there. So I thought, now how the hell did that student get to see those scenes? I mean, has he sort of had access to my colour slides or something? And then I noticed that my name was on the bottom, my signature, and the date. And so I sort of, in a way, questioned this, so challenged the vision to produce an answer to this. And the vision carried on and showed me all 26 pictures. And my name was on the bottom of each picture. And the dates were in sequence, and some of them were 3 years in advance. So at that point I began to get a little bit worried by this vision, particularly since number 27 was black. The screen went black. And the one before it, number 26, was a picture of Mount Everest, which seemed to be out of sequence with all the others. The others were Arctic or Antarctic. Here was a picture of Mount Everest. And then number 27 was black. And so I thought, when I get commissioned to do a picture of Everest, then I know that that's my last painting. And sure enough, of course, I was eventually.
And then finally, the painting of Prince Charles, sort of smiling. He wanted something of him smiling, and it's a wonderful likeness of him. It's really well done. And you also work with a scalpel, I know, when you do your painting. So I'm really impressed with the Prince Charles piece as well. It's been great fun spending time with you, sir.
Well, thank you, Herb.
Antarctica, and before we do so, we are going to get a little history lesson from one of the great Arctic historians, I guess, Wally Herbert. Good morning or good afternoon, depending when you folks are listening to this, or perhaps good evening, Mr. Herbert. A little bit of your background, then we'll move ahead.
Well, I was born in York in England. And after a few days I was taken to London, and a few weeks longer I was in Egypt, and I lived there until I was 5. And then at the age of 5 I was moved down to South Africa. This was during the war. Didn't come back to England until I was 13, and in that time I didn't go to school either. I didn't.
We're back on November 15th, 1994. We are queuing up right now at the boat deck. We're about to take our first steps actually on the Antarctic continent. We've been in the Shetland Islands heading to the Antarctic. We are actually going to take our first steps on the continent. Scheduled today is a Zodiac trip to take a look, a sightseeing tour, and then we're going to visit Wally Herbert's hut. We're in Charlotte Bay, and you can hear the queuing up right now. Great anticipation, big day. We will join you at our next event. You're listening to Visions, a series of visits to almost everywhere, and we are about to set foot, myself anyway, for the first time on.
I didn't have a proper schooling. I just was taught privately on a ranch in the Drakensberg Mountains by an old retired school teacher, and so she was very good at geography and English and history. She didn't know anything at all about maths or science, so I was no good at any of these things. So I came back to England at the age of 13 with absolutely no comprehension of these other subjects. So I then worked very hard for a few years to get my qualifications to go to university, and succeeded, but by that time I was so exhausted I decided I didn't want to go to the university after all. I went into the army. So I signed up in the army for 22 years in the army, and the army was soaking wet and horrible smell of steamy wetness, you know. And off the top of the rack where you put your luggage, there was a newspaper. It fell into my lap. There was a Daily Telegraph, and I remember it was already open at the page where they have advertisements for jobs. And my eye fell on a little job called, a little tiny notice saying, Expedition to Antarctica. And it was saying that they needed surveyors for 3 years. So I thought this was brilliant. And so I went into the John, the Lou, we were so pleased to have someone sign up for that length of time that they gave me all kinds of education. You see, I went to school for a year and a half, and they taught me how to make maps, and they taught me how to navigate. Then I went out to Egypt and worked in the Sahara for a little while making maps. So by the time I was 20, I was a map maker, qualified map maker. And then I managed to get out of the army, to my surprise as much as everybody else's, and to the total disgust of the army themselves, because they spent so much money on educating me. And then I hitchhiked back to England from Egypt. And then when I was driving to work one day in England, in a bus, and it was absolutely pelting down with rain, and everyone